Let's make hats on the Knitking or Knittax AM3 machine. Mine is labeled Knitking, but let's be clear, it's like this one and this one, Knittax machines, and not like the brother Knitking similar machines. We'll be making these hats. This is a baby size, and I also made an adult size. This video includes the pattern for several sizes right in the video because it's very simple. The bubbliness of this fabric is created using tuck stitches. The portion of the hat that's tuck stitched will be wider than the rest of the fabric, the hem and the crown. So there's a certain amount of shaping built in just because we changed stitches. Bubbles hold pockets of air, so the hat should be very warm for the weight of it. I'm going to demonstrate on my AM3 machine, which gets tuck stitch in an unusual way. But as we go along, I'll explain how to attempt the same pattern on an ordinary Japanese punch card machine. This movie is part of my 100 Recycled Hats playlist that I explain in the 100 Recycled Hats movie, wherein I try to make 100 hats for charity, all using rewound yarn from samples that were new and no longer needed. The purple hat is made with Tambibi. The white hats are mystery yarn of similar weight. This type of machine has a couple of unusual features, so let's go over some basics before we begin knitting. First, there are two ranges of stitch size. They are both on this dial. One is for stockinette, and that's the one we'll use today. One is for use with the ribber. I'm not using the ribber, so we can ignore that. I used stitch size 8 on the stockinette scale, except for the hems, which I did at one whole number smaller. Your choice of stitch size on a typical Japanese standard gauge machine would be similar. The AM3 has 6 interchangeable pattern wheels. They are installed simply by making sure the little hole in the wheel fits over that post. They sit there quietly to themselves until we depress the patterning knob. It must be held down for the entire pass when you want needles to be selected. The machine will select them on that row, pushing them all the way out to hold position. On any Japanese punch card machine, this row would be worked with the punch card locked on the first row and the machine set not to advance. On Brothers, we would also engage KC. Singers and studios just memorize it, and you don't know they've done it, but they have. When ready for pattern knitting, on Brothers, we engage the tuck buttons, in this case, because we're knitting tuck. On the Silver Reed family, you turn the selector to tuck, and on both, you need to set the card to advance. To get the tuck effect shown on these hats, I used wheel number 2. You could really knit with any of the pattern wheels, and on other kinds of machines, you could use any suitable tuck card and get a similar, though not identical, effect because different tuck stitches can look very different. Depending on the stitch you choose, the gauge will change. We don't care much about stitch gauge because we knew that it was going to get wider than the hat band, and the hat band is what fits the head. But you will probably need to adjust the number of rows that you knit in tuck stitch. That's easy to do. I'll show you in a minute. These are the sizes, the circumference at the hem of the hats we'll be knitting. You may cast on using every other needle or every single needle. What I did here is began with every other needle, ran the carriage across. Those needles picked up loops but did not knit, brought the second batch of needles into work, and that is called the automatic cast on this machine. Here's how it looks when we complete the hem. In my opinion, this is perfectly good looking from the knit side, and it's a judgment call whether you like it on the purl side. At main stitch size minus one whole number, knit 20, 22, or 24 rows depending on the size of hat you're knitting. If you are not a fan of the automatic cast on, you may also E-wrap either every needle or every other needle. I am not doing it quite the way the manual shows here, but it works fine for me. If you cast on using every other needle, be sure to put the remaining set of needles into work after knitting the first row. If you use the automatic cast on that begins with every other needle, here's a little trick about getting it to look nice. It will look like this, with a true stitch surrounded by 2 strands of yarn. If you pick up each strand of yarn, the finished result will look like this. However you choose to do it, close the hem by hanging each of the cast-on loops onto a working needle. The Knittax doesn't require you to do this step. I brought the needles forward so that the hung hem was all behind the latches and then pushed the needles back to working position. But if you're concerned that your cast-on may fall off the needles or make the first row difficult to knit, this step can help with either problem. After hanging the hem, knit 2 plain stockinette rows. And here comes the pattern knitting. Engage the button, push the carriage across. Your needles will be selected. Knit 2 plain rows. During these 2 rows, the same needles will stay in hold position. This is the needle retractor button. There's one on each side. Engage the left one now. This will cause the needles that are presently in hold to return to working position on the next pass. Note that when they do, the sinkers won't quite be back in working position yet, and as far as I can tell, that's perfectly normal. Now we're going to knit 4 plain rows and you'll see the sinkers return to their normal position. Be sure to disengage the needle retractor button. Knit across using the selector button. Follow that with 2 plain rows. Engage the needle retractor button, knit across, then knit 4 plain rows. That's an 8-row repeat, and I recommend doing it 6 times for babies, 7 for toddlers, 8, 9, and 10 for the various sizes of children, 11 for small to medium adults, and 12 for large adults. If you used a different tuck stitch pattern, go to the edge of the fabric and measure it. That is a pretty good approximation of how long the hat is thus far. We'll be adding some plain rows that add this amount of distance. So if your hat now measures one of these measurements, you should be ready to go. If not, knit a few more rows. We'll finish the hat with a few plain rows, different numbers for the different sizes. We'll be gathering the hat crown off, and a little tiny change that can make it much easier to get it off, especially on this machine, is to knit the very final row at the largest stitch size. Then we'll go across the bed, moving stitches to the yarn tail, having threaded that yarn tail into a yarn needle. This is the easiest way on this machine. The alternative would be to scrap off and work with the fabric in your lap, picking up the final row of main yarn stitches. So here's our knitted shape, and here's how we finish it. We're gathering off the crown now. You'll pull in the gathering thread, knot it, and stitch securely across the O that's formed. Then seam the 2 edges of the work together. And using this stitch, I found that back stitch pulled in slightly for length did the nicest job of preserving the look of the fabric along the seam. Your hem is 2 layers. Make it look its best by first pulling it lengthwise down the row dimension and then stitching the 2 layers together separately. Really soft yarns such as BB feel wonderful against the skin around the face, but they may not hold the tension of the hem snug enough to suit some wearers, especially if they work outdoors in the wind. If you find that to be the case, insert a piece of soft elastic between the 2 layers of hem and snug it up just enough that it will make that head stay huggy. Either side of this hat may be worn as the right side. If you choose to use the purl side out, make sure the hem closure is nice and neat.